Good evening and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with David Chernikoff. My name's Jamie Madsen. I'm the marketing and events coordinator here at Copperfields, and I'll also be your host for the evening. So for tonight, go ahead and keep an eye on the chat box. I will be using it to share links for tonight's title, discount codes, more information about David and the like. And additionally, the format will feature around 40 to 45 minutes of speaking, and then will be followed by a live Q&A. So any questions or comments that you have tonight, go ahead and submit under the Q&A icon, which you can find at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And now I'm really excited to introduce tonight's author, David Chernikoff. David has spent decades pursuing spiritual study and practice with remarkable teachers, including Ram Dass, Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg, Father Thomas Keating, to name a few. David is currently a guiding teacher for the Insight Meditation Community of Colorado. He teaches workshops and retreats throughout the US and has a private practice as a spiritual counselor and life coach. He currently lives in Boulder with his wife and daughter. And he's with us tonight to discuss his latest title, Life Part 2, 7 Keys to Awakening with Purpose and Joy as You Age. So thanks for being with us tonight, David. I'm really excited to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm delighted to be here and happy to share about this book that I recently completed. I'd like to add my welcome to Jamie's, and I'd like to begin our evening with a reading by Jack Kornfield, one of the teachers that Jamie just mentioned, who's been an important mentor and spiritual friend for me for many years. He writes, "My simple prayer is that in all things I learn to love well, that I learn to touch the ever-changing seasons of life with a great heart of compassion, that I live with the peace and justice I wish for the earth, that I learn to care fully and let go gracefully, that I enjoy the abundance of the earth and return to it from the natural generosity that is our human birthright, that through my own life, through joy and sorrow, in thought, word, and deed, I bring benefit and blessings to all that lives, that my heart and the hearts of all beings learn to be free." I chose to begin with that particular reading for a couple of reasons. One is that it's been a part of my own spiritual practice for many years and has been an extremely helpful reminder of what I understand my purpose for being on the earth to be. It also highlights what I understand to be the essence of conscious living and also what we could call conscious aging, a part of our life in which we are oftentimes freed up to give more of our time, energy, and attention specifically to the process of spiritual awakening. My intention in writing the book that I wrote was essentially related to what Jack talked about. Over the years of study and practice and service work, I've come to see that, in my understanding, what conscious living involves is learning to live fully and to love well. And what I tried to capture in the book that I wrote is what I've had the good fortune to learn from some of the wonderful teachers that Jamie mentioned about how to do just that, how to live fully and how to love well. So let me say a little bit about some of the things that I've learned, which I imagine will be familiar to many of you. First of all, this phrase, the second half of life, is something I'd like to comment about. Right? Carl Jung is often the person who this phrase is attributed to. He talked about the fact that from his point of view, in terms of spiritual and psychological development, there's something significant that occurs in what he called the second half of life. And as someone who's about to turn 72, that's been an interest of mine for many years. Jung saw this as a psychological and spiritual process that shifted its nature in the midlife process and continued to be a catalyst internally for us through later life and into extreme late life in some cases. I also use this notion of the second half of life in a second manner in this book, because although the emphasis is primarily on the chronological second half of life, it's also on the symbolic second half of life that sometimes is experienced when we go through a radical life change of some sort. For example, I worked with a 26-year-old man a number of years ago when I was still doing clinical psychological work, whose primary characteristic in terms of feeling good about himself throughout much of his life had been his intelligence. So at 26, he was in the process of finishing up a doctoral degree in psychology. There had already been significant discussion about it being published as a book. And he was very much looking forward to a long and exciting career for him in the academic world, as well perhaps as a part-time clinician. Sadly, though, before he completed his thesis, he was in a car accident, one car accident where he lost control of his vehicle. The good news was that he wasn't banged up too bad physically in terms of broken bones and such, although the car flipped. The bad news was that he sustained a significant closed head injury. And in that process, was left with a certain amount of cognitive impairment that significantly interfered with the intellect that had been so important to him for so long. So in the immediate aftermath of the accident, he had trouble reading and writing. He had very slow cognitive processing, had difficulty with word finding, and so forth. Right? At the time, I had somewhat of a subspecialty in working with people who had closed head injuries, and I often collaborated with a cognitive psychologist who would design computer programs to help them essentially rehab whatever those cognitive deficits were after their injury. Why I bring this example up is because for this particular young man, there was a point at which he said to me in one of our initial meetings, this is not even like the next chapter of my life. He said, this is book 2 of my life. It feels like I died and I'm starting over. And that's another kind of life part 2. That's another kind of second half of life. When I was doing a lot of hospice work in the 80s and 90s, I saw this with people who received advanced cancer diagnoses. All of a sudden, life was different in a significant way. And their sense of self was radically altered. They weren't sure who they were in a certain sense, and so forth, right? Likewise, in doing couples counseling, when people would sometimes go through a very painful marital breakup or lose an intimate partner to death, there would be a similar sense of, we used to be Bob and Marilyn as if it were one word. And now as just Bob, I don't even know who I am. So I wanted to address both levels of what we could understand life part 2 to mean when I was working on this book, with the primary emphasis being on the chronological process of growing older. One important aspect of this topic that really inspired me further to deepen my work in this area had to do with some research that a friend of mine was involved with back in the mid-90s. My friend's name is Drew Leader. He's a longtime professor at Loyola College in Baltimore, where he teaches East-West philosophy at the college. And he was given a grant because of his interest in views of aging in our culture to study the predominant models that we hold in our culture for the process of becoming an older human being. What came out of Drew's research was a recognition that there were three primary models operating in the culture as he saw it. And I'd like to talk a little bit about these and then talk about what I see to be a fourth model, which is the one that's really central to the writing that I did in this book. The first model that Drew identified, he called the socio-medical model. This is the model that we see in gerontology program, geriatric medicine, in the healthcare system in general, for example, in the fields of occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, for example. And it has a wonderful positive dimension to it because many of the people who go into these fields are highly compassionate, caring, and intelligent people. And they oftentimes are highly trained in the specific difficulties that are associated with living in an older physical body and also dealing with an older brain and an older mind experience. The underbelly or shadow side or limitation of the socio-medical model is because of the nature of our healthcare system. It's often the case that people are viewed in a very two-dimensional way. Instead of being seen in the wholeness and the richness of the life that they've lived, out of necessity, oftentimes because of financial and temporal limitations, people are viewed in terms of symptom alleviation, and oftentimes not much other than that. And that's a shortcoming here because all of us know that there's much more to who we are than whatever medical symptoms we're presenting. A second model that Drew identified in his research, he labeled the productive model. What he meant by this is that this is the model that essentially reminds us to, quote, use it or lose it. And this can be applied to the physical body in terms of exercise, in terms of stretching and movement and weight resistance work and practices like Tai Chi and yoga, Aikido, and so forth, where when we use our bodies and maintain a certain amount of flexibility and movement and activity, we tend to live a healthier life overall. And in the same way, when we exercise our minds with meditation and study and reading, other kinds of creative activity, creative arts in many cases, we function more fully, we live more fully in terms of what I was talking about earlier, and we feel better. Right? There's also an underbelly to this model, however. That has to do with the obsession we have in our particular culture with productivity and achievement, and the way in which we're taught from a very early age to equate our self-worth with our productivity. The problem with that, of course, is that as we go through midlife and into late life, our internal agenda changes oftentimes. And the things that are important to us and that we feel called to do with our time and energy are less about being productive in the conventional sense or achieving in such a way that we can be recognized by other people and acknowledged for our efforts. There's more of an inner relationship that we start to pay attention to in terms of how we understand ourselves internally, how we feel about the life that we've lived up to that point, and what we need to do to synthesize wisdom and compassion from long life experience in order to move toward the closure of our life with a sense of wholeness and completion and satisfaction, hopefully, or ideally. You know? So the productive model has a positive side. However, what it means to be productive for someone at 75 might be very different than what it means for someone at 35. That was certainly the case for me, and I suspect for many of us who have intentionally lived our lives or been interested in spiritual and transformational values. There are internal shifts that we feel called to honor and to listen to in terms of inner guidance and inner voices. So we have the socio-medical model, we have the productive model. The third model Drew identified, he called the consumer model. This is a model that basically is built upon the notion that I've paid my dues, in a sense, and now it's my turn. If I've been a family person, if I've been married or in a committed relationship and or raised children, for example, there's a certain amount of deferred gratification built in to parenting and family life. I know for myself, when my daughter first went to college, on one level, I was in shock because I couldn't believe she was old enough to do that. And at the same time, I was sad and felt a sense of grief related to the idea that my own age and the changes of life were being mirrored back to me. At the same time, there was something celebratory about that. It was a rite of passage, as much for my wife and myself as for our daughter, because our life was going to change significantly as a married couple. Yeah. And there was a certain feeling of now we can do certain things we couldn't do before. People who are fortunate enough to be people of significant means financially during this kind of stage of life often will do things that they wanted to do. They'll go and see the Galapagos Islands, or they'll go on a cruise, or someone who loves to play golf or tennis will be able to play a lot more of that than before. That's the upside of the consumer model. And I think it's very real. And it's a delightful aspect of becoming an older person, particularly if we're fortunate enough to not be struggling to make ends meet, which is an entirely different kind of situation, admittedly. Right? It also, though, has an underbelly. For most people who have been heavily interested in the deeper meaning in life, and or who have explored various kinds of spiritual and transpersonal teachings, there's only a limited amount of satisfaction in golf. Even if I read the Zen of golf or the Tao of golf, yeah, and I take a course on golfing mindfully, yeah, there's still a limited amount of meaning for most of us in that kind of activity. So, given that all of these models have strengths and weaknesses, what is the fourth model that I would propose? It's a model that I learned from a spiritual friend and mentor named Rabbi Zalman Schachter-Shalomi, who was a very beloved spiritual teacher who, among other things, was one of the founders of the Jewish renewal movement. He was someone who authored a number of books and over 150 articles over the course of years, and personally ordained a large number of rabbis in the Jewish renewal movement. He was also a very close friend of Ram Dass and a number of other people who were involved with psychedelic exploration in the 60s and 70s. And I met him when he moved to Boulder, Colorado, where I was living in the mid-90s. And he was offered a particular chair that was newly created by virtue of a grant given to Naropa University, where I was teaching, in the religious studies department. They created a chair called the World Wisdom Chair, and Rabbi Zalman Schachter-Shalomi, who most of us called Reb Zalman, was one of the people who was offered this chair and accepted it in 1996. Essentially, what Reb Zalman had done was recognize the same basic models that Drew talked about, seen their limitations, and proposed that we needed a fourth model that I would call, and what he called, a spiritual model or a transpersonal model. That is to say, that another way of understanding the second half of life chronologically is to recognize that in many cases, it's a time when we are freed up to become more directly focused on and interested in spiritual awakening. Again, not everyone is in this kind of situation or has the luxury financially to make the kind of changes we're talking about here. And I have no interest in any kind of elitism in this regard. But because of the affluence we do have in our country, there's a very large number of people who move through midlife into their 60s and 70s and have opportunities to make choices about what to do with the time and energy that's left in their lives. And what Reb Zalman proposed, and what I was inspired by in his teaching, was the possibility that we can be much more directly focused on cultivating the best of our human qualities that are associated with spiritual awakening in most of our great perennial wisdom traditions. Qualities like loving kindness, compassion, generosity, humor and lightness of being, patience, kindness, and so forth. Right? And so the question that Reb Zalman was asking, that I found really quite compelling, was what kinds of skillful means could we use to translate what we'd experienced over the years into a curriculum for spiritual awakening? That is to say, because the aging process involves a heightened awareness of change on the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual levels, we have to make choices about how we're going to relate to those changes, because how we relate to change is one of the primary determinants of the extent to which we suffer or find happiness. And what this model of spiritual, we called it spiritual eldering initially, becoming a conscious elder, not just an old person, involves is a series of skillful ways to transform the challenges of the aging process into part of a spiritual path. Right? How do we go about doing that? Let's just talk about this a little bit. First of all, this understanding of aging reminds us that the process of spiritual awakening is a developmental process. I think we can make a good case for the notion that it starts when we're children, actually. There was a study done some years ago in which children ages 4 to 8 years old were asked one simple question that's very closely related to what we would call spiritual values. And the question was, what does love mean? These are some of the answers. Love is that first feeling you feel before all the bad stuff gets in the way. Another child answered, love is when a girl puts on perfume and a boy puts on shaving cologne and they go out and smell each other. Another one. Love is when your puppy licks your face, even after you've left him alone for the entire day. When you love somebody, your eyelashes go up and down and little stars come out of you. Now notice this one, because this was probably an older kid. And you can see the maturational process actually beginning to happen. When you tell someone something bad about yourself, and you're scared they won't love you anymore, but then you get surprised, because not only do they still love you, they love you even more. So from as early as 4 to 8 years old, there are aspects of our being that are exploring what love actually is and what its role is in our lives. Well, if we fast forward to the far end of the lifespan and we look at people who have truly matured on the emotional, psychological, and spiritual levels, we see what it's like when people understood the aging process to be a process of transformation. This from Pablo Casals, the great musician and artist, at the age of 93. Each day, I am reborn. Each day, I must begin again. For the past 80 years, I have started each day in the same manner. It is not a mechanical routine, but something essential to my daily life. I go to the piano and I play 2 preludes and fugues by Bach. I cannot think of doing otherwise. It is a sort of benediction on the house. But that is not its only meaning for me. It is a rediscovery of the world of which I have the joy of being a part. It fills me with the awareness of the wonder of life, with a feeling of the incredible marvel of being a human being. The music is never the same for me, never. Each day, it is something new, fantastic, and unbelievable. When I first read something like this, and I've worked with personally and read many things like this over the years now, I was so struck by what a contrast it was to the predominant view in our culture that life is a downhill process from choose an age. 39 if you're Jack Benny, 49 for some people, 59 for some people. But starting in about midlife for many people, the fear that we're going to eventually be old and irrelevant and put aside like an old shoe starts to come home to us. And in many cases, it's not uncommon for people to feel humiliated or embarrassed about being an older human being. What a spiritual perspective says about aging, and what indigenous cultures have recognized for millennia, is that yes, our bodies change when we get older, and our abilities shift in such a way that certain capacities become stronger and actually better and more effective, and others diminish somewhat. That's true. However, what's clearly possible for someone like Pablo Casals is that the last part of life can be a fruitional time in our lives that has its own quality of richness, its own warmth, its own joy, a quiet joy that in Christian and contemplative teachings is sometimes called the peace that surpasses understanding. Let's look at one or two more examples of what I'm talking about. People who didn't buy into the predominant models of aging that I described in those first three that came out of Drew's research. Polly Francis was a well-known photographer and fashion illustrator who died in 1978, I think it was. When she was in her 90s, she wrote a wonderful series of articles for the Washington Post. In one of them, she described what her inner life was like, and this is what she said. A new set of faculties seems to be coming into operation. I seem to be awakening to a larger world of wonderment, to catch little glimpses of the immensity and diversity of creation. More than at any other time in my life, I seem to be aware of the beauties of our spinning planet and the sky above. And now I have the time to enjoy them. I feel that old age sharpens our awareness. Again, so counter to the stereotypes. Last one. This was actually the first of these that I came across when I started to study in the area of conscious aging and the psychological and spiritual aspects of aging. From the writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The person who sent this to me said he was just about to turn 90 when he wrote this. How much easier it is then, how much more receptive we are to death when advancing years guide us softly to our end. Aging thus is in no sense a punishment from on high, but brings us its own blessings and a warmth of colors all its own. There is even warmth to be drawn from the waning of your own strength compared with the past. Just to think how sturdy I once used to be. You can no longer get through a whole day's work at one stretch. But how good it is to slip into the brief oblivion of sleep. And what a gift to wake once more to the clarity of your second or third morning of the day. And your spirit can find delight in limiting your intake of food, in abandoning the pursuit of novel flavors. You are still of this life, yet you are rising above the material plane. Growing old serenely is not a downhill path, but an ascent. So what are the implications of what I'm talking about here? And what is it I talk about in this book that I'm hopeful will be of benefit to people who have an interest in the kinds of issues I'm talking about this evening? I'm suggesting that if we choose to examine the view we're holding of the aging process, we're then in a position to frame it in a way that is life-affirming and positive, rather than life-negating and what I would call deluded, frankly, confused. My own sense is that the primary views we have of aging in this culture represent a kind of societal or cultural pathology, like a neurosis of a certain kind. What skillful means can we use if we are interested in a spiritual perspective on aging, in which we actualize as fully as possible our human capacities for love and for wisdom? Well, the first one is the one I've been talking about, which oftentimes in psychological work is called cognitive reframing. That is, flushing to the surface all of the negative messaging we've experienced in relation to aging, examining it to see if it actually rings true on the level of our intuitive wisdom, and rejecting the aspects of it that don't, so that we can embrace something more life-affirming. Why is this important? Well, Here's a clinical study that helps us see why it's important. Yeah, I'll just summarize this for you. This was a piece of research reported in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2002. The synopsis. This research found that older individuals with more positive self-perceptions of aging measured up to 23 years earlier lived 7.5 years longer on average than those with less positive self-perceptions of aging. This advantage remained after age, gender, socioeconomic status, loneliness, and functional health were included as covariates. In other words, they isolated the effect of the person's view of aging, and they found how significant it was. 7.5 years more life was experienced by people who had a significantly more positive view of aging. If some pharmaceutical company invented a pill that could do that, it would be on the front page of the New York Times in 2-inch letters. I strongly suspect that this didn't even make it into a newspaper. Yeah? But it helps us understand how important it is, what view we choose for becoming an older person. Yeah? In Buddhist tradition, we talk about what's called attachment to view, as the Buddha called it, and the implications of that in terms of how much we suffer or how much well-being and happiness we experience. Other skillful means that come into play here, what I would call a life review process is often extremely helpful. What I think a lot of us know is that simply living a long time does not automatically make us a wise elder. I'm guessing that most or all of us have met older people who we could say would be poster children for how we don't want to experience our aging process. In order to become a wise elder, we have to take a good look at how we've lived and how we are living. We have to forgive ourselves for the ways in which we've been unskillful or the mistakes we've made and the harm we might have caused to ourselves and or others, and find some way to make peace and develop self-compassion in relation to ourselves. We do want to review our lives and also acknowledge the things we did well when we acted in wholesome and skillful ways and were beneficial, perhaps in helping or mentoring younger people and doing various kinds of service work, whether informally, with something as simple as taking a neighbor to the doctor, or perhaps working professionally in a service-oriented profession. Yeah? Life review enables us to see what we did well, what we did unskillfully, what we've learned, and to assimilate the wisdom and the compassion from those experiences, which we then ideally aspire to pass on to future generations. So the skills of mentoring often come into play. One of the things I loved about teaching graduate psychology students at Naropa University for most of the 20 years between 1990 and 2010 was the joy of being with people who were very excited about a new profession they were being trained in and aspired to work in, and passing along some of what I had experienced and learned in many years of working in that field and doing related kinds of what I call people work. I want to keep an eye on the clock here because I want some time for conversation. Right? But I do want to offer one definition of conscious aging so that perhaps we have a succinct way to think about it. Not that I want to suggest that this is the right way to look at what I'm talking about when I talk about conscious aging, which I see to be largely synonymous with conscious living. But I do think it's a good starting place for reframing how we look at our own aging process and the aging process in general. 20 years ago, I was hired by the institute that Reb Zalman had started, which at that time was called the Spiritual Eldering Institute. It later was renamed Saging International, SAGE-ING, Saging International, and is a thriving organization presently that offers a lot of wonderful courses and programs and activities. I was hired to be the education and training director for the organization. And at one of the staff meetings we were having at the time, the executive director, a friend of mine named Lori, interrupted a comment that I made and said, hang on a minute, David. You know, we as a team are always using this phrase conscious aging. I was thinking about it recently, and I realized I'm not sure what that means. Right? And she said to me, would you be willing to write a definition of that for our next monthly newsletter? Without thinking too much, I said, sure, as if it would be an easy task. Not the case. It wasn't an easy task. I spent the next 2 weeks till the newsletter came out wrestling with what I understood that to mean. This is what I came up with. Conscious aging is a growth-oriented way of living that emphasizes the cultivation and celebration of wisdom, love, and insight into the nature of ultimate reality. One more time. Conscious aging is a growth-oriented way of living that emphasizes the cultivation and celebration of wisdom, love, and insight into the nature of ultimate reality. That's the task for people who move through midlife into later life in terms of what I'm calling a spiritual model of growing older. I'm not suggesting that this is the correct perspective. I'm simply suggesting that it's one that I've embraced and found to be enormously beneficial. And I'm also saying I've met a number of people now over the last 25 or 26 years that I've been working in this area who have had a similar experience to my own in relation to this kind of perspective. One of the people who best exemplified this process, who just died a little over 2 years ago, and I imagine is familiar to some or many of you, is Ram Dass, who ironically, as some of you may know, had a very severe stroke in February of 1997. The stroke occurred when he was working on a book on spirituality and aging, which was later published because he was assisted by some people after the stroke and came out as a wonderful book called Still Here. So what I'd like to do is close with some of his words because in a way, he says it so well. Let's just see if I can find where I put him. Here he is. This is how he completed his book, Still Here. This book is more of my, quote, advance scout role. These days, I'm the advance scout for the experiences of aging. And I've come back from the scouting party to bring good news. The good news is that the spirit is more powerful than the vicissitudes of aging. My stroke was a good test for my faith. The bar was high. I came away from the stroke firm in my faith, and I now know that my faith is unshakable. That assurance is the highest gift I received from the stroke. And I can say to you now, with an assurance I could not have felt before, that faith and love are stronger than any changes, stronger than aging, and, I am very sure, stronger than death. I'd like to stop here because I'm very interested in any comments or reflections or questions any of you might have. And I'd be happy to speak to those. I see that there's one that's shown up already. So I'll go ahead and we'll make the transition to questions, or if you have comments or reflections, I'd be happy to share those with the group as well. Do you want to go ahead, or do you have a comment to make, Jamie?
I've got it. And thank you so much. That was wonderful. But let's start with the questions. And we have plenty of time, everyone. So feel free to get your questions in. So Gail has a comment from a 68-year-old woman. I like the idea of being an advanced scout and very much appreciate my friendships with women in their 80s who can give me the view from the road ahead. That's great.
Nice.
And we have a couple questions asking about the writing process of your book and what that was like. Feel free, everyone.
So I'm not exactly sure what aspect of the writing process, but I can share a little bit about it, certainly.
Yeah, I think maybe how you went about what you chose to write about and how you narrowed it down. I even that definition of aging is interesting. I wonder how you came upon that.
Well, what happened to me in regard to this book was that I've been an avid reader since I was about 4 or 5 years old. I've always loved books, and I found them to be an incredibly helpful and enriching part of my life. And yet most of my work as a teacher that goes back, probably 50 years now, has been as a speaker. So, I wrote papers in graduate school. I wrote occasional articles for newsletters, but I'd never tried to write a book. I did have the good fortune of studying with a lot of the teachers that you mentioned. And because of that, I felt tremendous gratitude to these people who had passed on to me what they had learned in their own spiritual lives, right? And so a couple of years ago, I saw 70 coming up, right? And I was doing the kind of life review process that I referred to in my earlier comments. And I realized that writing a book popped up as a kind of bucket list item for me. It was something I wanted to do and I'd never tried to do. And I had reached a point in my life when I felt like I could do that. My daughter was through college. I wasn't paying a mortgage. There were certain things that freed up my time and energy. So I looked at what was most important to me to pass along. What had I learned from these generous teachers that I'd been so fortunate to study with that I could pass along in the sense of paying it forward, right? And I put a book proposal together. There was some synchronicity that came into play. Some people were, numerous times over the years, people had encouraged me to write a book. And that happened again about this time when I was also thinking it was a good idea. And I put in a proposal and they accepted it.
Yeah.
And my intention was essentially to express gratitude to my teachers, to pass along what I'd learned, and to do something new meaning learn to write a book, right?
Right.
The material was very familiar and had been for years, right? But the writing of a book was a new experience. And to be a novice at 69 or 70 working on a book
Yeah,
was great. It was enlivening, refreshing. I loved the challenge of it, which certainly it was challenging at times.
absolutely.
Um, and yet, intuitively, it felt like the right time and the right thing to be doing. And so the process was satisfying and meaningful and joyful in and of itself. And I was certainly hoping it would move out into the world and be helpful to people.
That is such a great answer. And yeah, pay it forward to all of us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We do have a couple comments here.
Mm-hmm.
Eileen is wondering, what wisdom would you share about navigating this turbulent time we're in when you're in your 60s and beyond and can't really make new friends and also can't easily see the ones you already have?
Uh, hmm. I think it's a really wonderful time to cultivate our inner lives, not exclusively, because I think Zoom, for example, is a great vehicle for helping us to maintain some connection and contact with each other. But because our circumstances in certain ways have insisted that we be with ourselves and less socially oriented in terms of actual physical contact, rather than resist that or judge that or be frightened or fearful of that, we could also look at it as an invitation to explore our own inner lives on a deeper level than we perhaps have in the past. You know? That could include being a part of a community of other people who are exploring their inner lives as well. For example, one of the first things I did when COVID started back in March of 2020, right? Is that right? Or was it? It feels like it was 10 years ago to me.
Yeah,
But
March 2020.
yeah, when it started, I got, as one of the guiding teachers of a meditation community, I got a number of other teachers who were good friends of mine together, and we started to offer daily morning meditation 7 days a week.
Wow.
Each one of us took a day, and from 8 to 8:45 Mountain Time every morning, we went online so we could maintain our sense of community, or sangha, as it's called in Buddhist circles, right? And people were isolated and alone in many ways, but also were seeing each other on a regular basis online and not feeling 100% alone. So I think making use of various opportunities we have to take online courses or be part of online communities, on the one hand, is helpful and supportive. And at the same time, to develop our meditation or prayer practice, or to deepen our study of Jungian psychology or some aspect of the inner life that we're interested in, makes a lot of sense to me in a situation like the present one. And I think that combination can support us and help us through these difficult times.
Thanks. So I think you kind of touched on this one, but an anonymous attendee is wondering, how do you stay centered and positive when, as we age, there are more sudden life changes, disease, etc., and losses?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I just had an experience of this kind, where a close friend of mine uh, had a serious stroke on Christmas morning day.
Oh boy.
And this was somebody in her 60s. Came like a light of bolting out, like a bolt of lightning out of the blue. Um, I think this is where spiritual training comes into play. When we look deeply at who and what we are, what begins to happen is we see that on one level, we are human and vulnerable and fragile in certain ways. We have a body and a personality, and that's one aspect of who we are. What the spiritual teachings are saying is that there's another dimension to who we are that gets labeled differently by different wisdom traditions. We could call it Buddha nature in Buddhism. In some Abrahamic religions, we call it the soul. In transpersonal psychology, we call it the true self. Suzuki Roshi, who started San Francisco Zen Center, talked about big mind and little mind, right? But what we start to see when we get involved in spiritual practices and teachings is that, in a certain sense, we live on two levels of reality simultaneously. One is the human level, right? The other we could call the divine level, or the level of the Tao, or the level of our true nature. Yeah. Well, what enables us to deal with these difficult aspects of aging, which include loss and sudden experiences related to our health or our cognitive functioning and so forth, is that while one part of us is acknowledging the human struggle and sadness and grief associated with these issues, another part of us is simply present and with an open heart and a quiet mind as what I would call a compassionate witness. Yeah? And that's where we find our strength and a kind of equanimity and balance. The beauty of the human part of us is that innate within it is a capacity for transcending the small self and coming to know this vaster, more profound dimension of our nature. And my understanding is all of the world's wisdom traditions are teaching methods that enable us to do that. So the more that we're able to stand in that place of true nature and presence, and at the same time acknowledge our humanness without seeing that as the whole of who we are, we find the courage and the strength and the compassion to deal with great difficulties in the way that Ram Dass talked about in that quote that I completed my talk with. I hope that speaks to it a little bit.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yeah. So Julie says, David, thank you. So grateful for hearing about your book. I will look forward to reading it and learning all the 7 keys. Can you say more about the life review, please? And I'm assuming that's in your book. So maybe, once they read it, but you can give us just a little snippet.
Yeah, there's a little bit about it in the book, but there are whole books about life review. I mentioned that organization called Saging International. Yeah.
I shared that in the chat for everyone.
Okay, so they have a website and a store. And in that store, there's a book called the Spiritual Eldering Workbook, right? Okay. The Spiritual Eldering Workbook has a number of exercises that involve life review, right? So there's a number of different exercises that come into play. It can be looking back at our history of relationships and then reviewing the different experiences we've had in our most significant relationships to see which of them are completed, so to speak, and in good harmony, and which, if any of them, feel unfinished and need to be addressed. Yeah. Another one would be to reflect upon our activities, the most important activities that we've experienced over time, and to see, like I did when I got to where I was approaching 70, was there anything I hadn't done in my life I really wanted to do? Right? And the realization that I wanted to write this book came out of that life review process.
Got it.
Right? What did I want to do that I had not done to date? And it came up very clearly to me. Yeah? There's another exercise taught by a Jungian teacher named Ira Progoff, called stepping stones, where you take an area you want to learn about. For example, I sometimes teach workshops and retreats on what's called death as a spiritual teacher, right? And I have people go back to the earliest memory they have of an encounter with death. Maybe they were 3 years old and their grandparent died, you know? And I have them identify 6 or 7 significant experiences related to death that they had, and then remember them briefly and try to understand what they learned from each of them. You know? And that's another example of exploring a particular aspect, like how I relate to death and how that's changed over time. You know? So that's another example of a type of life review. But there are numerous books on life reminiscence and life review and the psychological benefits of doing that work.
How interesting. And you said that was the spiritual eldering?
Eldering, yeah, like elder with ing.
Got it. And is it a workbook? I'm going to go ahead and
Yeah,
great.
the spiritual eldering workbook,
Got
and
it.
it would be found in the store on the website of saginginternational. Just saging.org is their
Great.
website.
Great. I have both of those. I'll include it in the follow-up email tomorrow for everyone. So we have just a couple questions left. I hope we can, I know it's a little bit past, but if you can stay, it'd be awesome. Catherine is wondering, do you see differences and similarities in how the war generation versus the baby boomers versus Gen X are approaching aging and their feelings about aging? If yes, can you describe the differences and some similarities?
Boy. Read that to me one more time.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm hearing it accurately.
So she's wondering the differences and similarities in how people see aging across the war generation, baby boomers, and Gen X. Wondering if they're similar or how they may differ.
That's a wonderful question. I think in the war generation, the stereotypes about aging predominated in many ways. Not exclusively. I mean, there were certainly elders who celebrated the aging process and who found it to be a fruitful and fruitional time. But I think the stereotypes in the society were quite entrenched at that point. You know? I think when it moved into the boomer generation, there was a way in which everything was challenged. One of the ways that I would characterize that generation is, we're not going to do it like anybody else ever did. Yeah, and the 60s and 70s in particular threw it all up for examination. The women's movement, the men's movement, what it meant to be a woman, what it meant to be masculine or a male, what it meant to get married, if you changed your understanding of what a woman was and what a man was. And in the same sense, the seeds of what we're seeing now in terms of this view of aging that I'm advocating, I think were planted in the boomer generation. Right? I have a better sense for that mainly because those are primarily the people that I've worked with.
Interesting.
Right? Most of the trainings that I've done, both to train facilitators in this work and people I've worked with directly, were in I would say the 50 to 75-year-old range. Often what sometimes are called well elders, who are still pretty healthy and high functioning. They're not quite frail elders at that point yet. And a lot of these people, we know from the medical research, were living longer with more quality of life in those years than we ever have before. Yeah.
Right.
In terms of Gen X, it's an interesting question. I have a pretty limited amount of experience with younger people because there's so little intergenerational contact in this culture. And that's one of the problems that we're trying to address here, right? because we tend to stratify horizontally. So the 20-somethings hang out with the 20-somethings,
Right.
and the midlife people hang out with the midlife people. But in indigenous cultures that are wiser than ours, there's much more intergenerational contact, which benefits everybody, because the younger people receive mentoring from the older people, and the older people experience a sense of meaning and purpose and feel valued and recognized because of their long life experience and the wisdom they've accumulated. Yeah. So that's part of what we're advocating in this work, is that we bring back the role of the wise elder, and we flush out of our systems this notion that elders are over the hill and irrelevant because they don't know the latest software program or something like that.
Right. Right.
So I don't know how well that answers it, but
No,
it's a good question. It would be a good one over a pot of espresso.
that was incredibly fascinating. Thanks so much for the explanation. Well, I know we're running over. I've been receiving so many thank yous and how much people have appreciated this hour. And Judy says, your talk has made me at 80 look at aging in a more positive way. So I think that's lovely.
Wonderful.
And to all of you on here, yes, this is being recorded. Everyone will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording, the discount code, a link to the book, all of the links that were shared tonight, and hopefully that workbook I'll get in there. It's been great and really fascinating tonight, David. Thank you so much for being with us.
No, thank you for inviting me and for hosting this, Jamie. I really appreciate it.
Great. And hopefully we'll get you in person real soon.
Great. Yeah, I'd love it. Thanks to everybody who joined us tonight. Although I can't see you, I've enjoyed being with you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Have a great evening.
Okay, take care.
You too.